right, ready? All right. Now, in our lives, we often see challenges that seem impossible to deal with. We strive for success, yet sometimes we find ourselves seeming things, we find ourselves facing things that seem impossible to overcome. On D Day, June 6, 1944, Allied forces faced the impossible task of storming the heavily fortified beaches of Normandy. The plan was bold and it was unconventional. It involved extensive preparation and a leap of faith as thousands of soldiers landed under enemy fire. Now, despite the uncertainty and chaos, this pivotal moment marked the beginning of a crucial turning point in World War II. Now, in World War II, we can see D Day, and just like in the book of Joshua, God gives the Israelites an unexpected strategy, and that was to march around the city for 7 days, 6 days in silence, and the seventh day to scream. Now, just as the Allied forces had to trust their weird strategy to achieve victory, we too are sometimes called to follow God's plan so that we might obtain victory in our daily challenges. Follow God's plan. That is what our main goal in life is to follow God's plan. Now, as we look at the story of Joshua and the falling of Jericho, we see three key principles. And is to prepare for God's plan. Now, before the Battle of Jericho, even in earlier chapters, chapter 3, the end of chapter 3, chapter 4, and chapter 5, the Israelites had to prepare spiritually and physically. They moved from relying on the manna of God to eating the produce of the land. Now, they were reminded that victory doesn't just come from their own strength, but from God's presence. We must too prepare ourselves spiritually, mentally, and sometimes even emotionally. The second thing is we have to be obedient to God's plan. Now, even though God's plan was unconventional for Jericho, I mean, the Israelites had to march around the city for 6 days in silence. I can barely go 5 minutes. But it didn't make any sense by military standards. But the Israelites obeyed exactly as God. Yo, yo, no, no, no. I haven't gotten there yet. No, this is my uh summarized statement. This is still page 3. All right. It didn't make any sense by military standards, but the Israelites obeyed exactly as God instructed, and victory followed. The third thing is we have to remain faithful to God's plan. It's super easy to be obedient uh, in the beginning, but it's super hard to continue to be faithful to God's plan. The Israelites had to remain faithful to the process for 7 days, even when it seemed like nothing was happening. Now, on the seventh day, when they followed God's instructions faithfully, the walls of Jericho fell. And even after the walls of Jericho fell, they had to follow the words of God to the T. Now, these principles remind us that following God's plan, from preparation and obedience to even faithfulness, will lead us to His victory. Now, by the end of the message, I want each of you to believe that embracing and following God's plan, no matter how unconventional it may seem, will lead you to experience His blessings and victory in your life. Now, as we explore the account of Joshua and the Israelites, we'll see how their commitment to follow God's unconventional plan led to miraculous victories. We have to prepare for God's plan. In Joshua 5:12-15, it says, "And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land, and there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year." When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went up to him and said to him, "Are you for us, or are you for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am of the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." At this point, Joshua falls on his face to the earth and worships and says to him, "What does the Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Now, in these verses, we can see the end part of where the Israelites are preparing for battle after celebrating their first Passover. This is significant because it marks a new beginning for them, transitioning from the reliance on God's manna to relying on God's provisions in the promised land. The commander of the Lord's army appears to Joshua, emphasizing that victory comes not from his own strength, but from God's presence. Now, how many of you guys like the NFL? I'm a huge Lions fan, as you guys know. And as we can see, this is Jared Goff, one of the most influential people of the Detroit Lions. The interesting thing about Jared Goff is he was originally on the Los Angeles Rams. After facing setbacks and even losing a Super Bowl, he'd never get there. He was traded to the Lions in 2021. Now, instead of succumbing to doubts and he even led the Lions to a 3-12-1 season, that's pretty good. But Goff embraced the challenge. Instead of, he was trusting in Dan Campbell and the rest of the coaching staff and the game plan that they created. He had to prepare. He had to prepare for the game plan. He had to prepare his body, not only physically and mentally, but he also had to do it emotionally. Now, his determination and willingness to adapt transformed the team. I think they're Super Bowl contenders this year, and that is within 3 years. Now, just as Goff committed to following the strategy and preparing for the strategy set before him by the coaching staff, we too must recognize that our strength comes from following God's plan, even when the plan seems uncertain. Now, ask yourself, are you relying on your own strength sometimes too much? It's easy to fall in a trap of self-reliance. Just like Jared Goff, he can't rely on himself. He has to rely on the offensive line to protect him. He has to rely on the wide receivers to catch the ball. Reflect on a current challenge that you may face. How might you invite God into that situation, trusting in his plan instead of your own understanding? Now that we are preparing for God's plan, we have to be obedient to God's plan. Now, if we look at Joshua 6:3-12, you can see that it says, "Now you shall march around the city, all the men of war going around you the city once. Thus shall you do for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark. Now on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. And the people shall go up, everyone straight before him." So Joshua, the son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, "Take up the covenant, and let the 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." And he said to the people, "Go forward, march around the city, and let the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord." Now, just as Joshua had commanded the people, the 7 priests, bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord, went forward, blowing the trumpets with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. The armed men were walking before the priests who were blowing the trumpets, and the rear guard was walking after the ark, while the trumpets blew continually. But Joshua commanded the people, saying, "You shall not shout or make your voice heard, neither shall say any word go out of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout." So he caused the ark of the Lord to circle the city, going about it once, and they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Then Joshua rose early in the morning and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. Now, this oh, and this I'm gonna accidentally drop this stuff. And the seven priests rang the seven trumpets of ram's horn before the ark of the Lord walked on. They blew the trumpets continuously, and the armed men who were walking before them and the rear guard was walking after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continually. And the second day they marched around the city once and returned into the camp. So they did for 6 days. Now, this passage kind of describes the unique strategy God gives Joshua for conquering Jericho. By marching around the city for 6 days, 7 days, the Israelites demonstrate their faith and obedience. Now, in 1963, the St. Louis Arch was started. They had to follow a detailed blueprint, trusting the design even though they couldn't see the final design. Now, each day they laid more and more of the building. They had to trust and they had to be obedient to the architects because if they messed up by just a mere inch, it would have been messed up by over 63 feet when it was finished. Now, when the final piece was put in place, they kind of stepped back to see a magnificent structure that was built through pressure, through patience and adherence to the plan. Similarly, the Israelites had to trust God's instructions even when the plan seemed unusual. Their faith in following the blueprint God provided ultimately led to their victory. Now, reflect on your own life in the areas where God may be asking you to follow his guidance, even when it doesn't make sense. Are there situations where you feel called to take a step of faith? Consider how you can actively listen for God's direction and commit yourself to following his plan, trusting that his design will lead you to victory in your life. Embrace the process of obedience, knowing that each step in faith brings you closer to a fulfillment of his promise. And even though we may be obedient to God's plan, even after the part of the plan is finished, we have to remain faithful to God's plan. Now, if we read in Joshua 13 through 25, it says, "And the seven priests bringing the seven trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord walked on. And they blew the trumpets continuously. And the armed men were walking before them, and the trumpet was walking at the ark of the Lord while the trumpets blew continuously. And the second day they marched around the city once and returned in the camp. So they did for 6 days. On the seventh day they rose early at the dawn of the day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And on the seventh time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, 'Shout, for the Lord has given you the city, and the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and all those who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But you, keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest when you have devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it. But all the silver and gold and every vessel of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord, and they shall go into the treasury of the Lord.' So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people went up into the city, every man straight before them, and they captured the city. They devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkey, with the edge of the sword. But to 2 men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, 'Go into the prostitute's house and bring out from there the women and all who belong to her, as you swore to her.' So the young men who had been spies went in and brought Rahab and her father and her mother and brothers and all who had belonged to her, and they brought all her relatives and put them outside the camp of Israel. And they burned the city with fire and everything in it. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put in the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And she had lived in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent out Jericho." Now, in this passage, God gives Joshua specific instructions on how to conquer Jericho. After he does this, and they have already completed most of the plan, the Israelites are commanded to march around the city a final day. They had to have the men leading the way, following the priest carrying the ark. Now, on the seventh day, they are to march around the city 7 times, and the priest will blow their trumpets. After this, people are instructed to shout. Now, after this, God kind of promises the Israelites that if they are obedient and faithful to this plan, that Jericho is theirs. The plan emphasizes obedience, faith, and the importance of following God's unconventional strategy. Now, growing up, my mom loved to have flower gardens. Every time we moved, we planted a new one. If you see here, this is a couple of the pictures of flower garden that me and my mom worked on in 2017. Now, as you can see here, it's from June. It's a little late to be planting flowers. So at this point, it's already getting hot, and it's dry, and we don't even know if the flowers were going to survive at this point. Now, another thing that had happened in 2017 is it was one of the hottest and driest summers that Michigan has had in over 30 years. We had to be faithful to the plants, and we had to water them so that they might live as they grew out the roots. The growth of the flowers was so slow that I thought we had failed. But even though I had thought that we had failed, my mom told me to keep water the plants so that they might live. Now, despite my thoughts of failure and the unconventional ways that my mom had me water and fertilize the plants, the flowers blossomed better than I had hoped. Now, what I thought looked like failure turned into something thriving and beautiful because we stayed faithful to watering them every day. Now, God's plans aren't always immediate or obvious, but He calls us to trust Him and remain faithful. Just like the Israelites did at Jericho at the end, where they burned the city and they only put the iron and the gold and they put the bronze all in the treasury. They had to be faithful to complete that part of the plan. Now, just like the Israelites at Jericho, even when the process seems slow or confusing to them, they remained faithful in this period of time. Like my mother's encouragement to keep watering the plants, God invites us to be persistent in faith, trusting that He's working behind the scenes even when we don't see Him. And when we stay faithful to His plan, even when it feels like we're failing, we can be confident that God will bring something far more beautiful than we could ever imagine. Now, the Israelites could have easily given up after 6 days of remaining silent. Like I said, I can't even go 5 minutes. But they stayed faithful. And on the seventh day, when they followed God's plan, exactly as He had instructed, the walls of Jericho came crashing down. That is why we have to continuously follow God's plan, so that we may see victory in Him. Now, as we close, let us remember that following God's plan may sometimes seem unconventional. Whether you're preparing to storm a beach that is heavily under gunfire or just watering some plants in your backyard, it sometimes seems unconventional. It is always the path to true victory, though. Just like the Israelites, we have to have the courage to trust in God's timing and methods. Now, as you leave here today, consider how you can actively seek to follow God's plan in your life. Trust Him and take that step of faith and watch how He transforms your challenges to testimony.